Now we'll begin our discussion of Asian American history with the first migratory flow of Asians to the United States. And these groups would be the Chinese immigrants during the mid 19th century, and they'll be followed by the Japanese during the late 19th century and early 20th century. But by the way, the first documented Asians to the United States were actually Filipinos. They were working on the Acapulco galleon trade network. And they arrived in what's called Morro Bay today. I believe it's near Santa Barbara, maybe, in California. And they arrived in 1587, okay, but as a very small number. The first significant migratory flow were the Chinese, okay, Chinese migrants coming to the United States. Now, the question emerges, what led to the migration of Chinese to the United States in the first place by, this time in the mid 1800s? And the answer to this question directs us to an interesting historical connection or interconnection, actually. If you look at the slide, the aspects of this interconnection involve capitalist expansion, labor, and race. Okay, and this is our first theme in the course, obviously. And it should be mentioned that this particular interconnection applies not to just Asian migrants, but to many other ethnic groups, before Asians and certainly after Asians. In fact, today it's still applicable. When you think about, for example, the first African slaves arriving in the early 1600s, in the Virginia colony, for example, you think about labor. You think about the plantation system, which is a very early form of capitalism. All right. And then you move forward to our Industrial Revolution, which is roughly the time period we're discussing Asian American history. And that takes place officially after the Civil War through the 20th century. Well, there's going to be other ethnic groups involved in this interconnection, like Italian immigrants and Eastern Europeans, Polish, Jewish, and so forth, right? They'll be working in the factories, right? They'll dominate really the factory population, right? Working in the huge industrial cities like New York and, Chicago and so forth. And then, as I mentioned, just fast forward to today, you can see this connection applying to, let's say, South Asians, right? Let's say people from India, Pakistan, working in, for example, the technological sector in Silicon Valley, right? So this interconnection is definitely a very wide one. Okay, it casts a wide net, so to speak. But we'll discuss this interconnection as as it specifically applies to the Chinese and the Japanese, as I just mentioned. All right. So, what are we talking about in this interconnection? So, here's actually a brief. It's quite complicated, but here's a brief explanation of this interconnection. All right. Well, if you know anything about capitalism as an economic system, economic approach, as a particular, let's say, economic modality, what preceded capitalism, you might know this, is feudalism. And this is what characterized the economic systems of the medieval period, right? Where it's profoundly agrarian. Needless to say, it's before, factories and so forth, and things were very local, okay? And again, move forward to early capitalism, you see particularly Europe starting to break away from the feudal world, okay? And they're developing early forms of capitalism by the 1600s, some say even before that. But nonetheless, what you're seeing is capitalism taking over feudalism. It doesn't happen overnight. It's actually happens in slow motion, but in our country, the United States of America, we've had mostly in place from the beginning of English settlement a market system in place. Okay, that's not to say there were some feudal elements in the very beginning and early Chesapeake settlement or even Puritan settlement in New England, but for the most part, there's always been the market economy. We don't have a purely feudal past. Now, now capitalism itself inheres in expansion. What does this mean? It's inherently expansionist, right? It must expand. It doesn't just stay static or stagnant. Okay. In fact, that's how you should think of feudalism. It's just stagnant, right? It doesn't grow. But there's this, sense of growth when I think about capitalism as a system, right? For example, think about a coffee shop, right? Today, even, and let's say it becomes successful, so they decide to expand, open another coffee shop across town, right? And that's successful too, so they're making more money, the owners, so they decide to move into the next state. And it expands state by state. Finally, it's national, and who knows, it could be even international at one point. In fact, when you think about Starbucks, that's exactly what happens. It starts with one coffee shop and it just expands if it's successful. Okay. Now, you could talk about many industries. You could talk about, the, or let's just say Nike or McDonald's, or, the technological sector again. All right. So that's the nature of capitalism. It inheres in expansionism, like I said. Now, during this period we're talking about, okay, the 19th century, we're specifically talking about Asians. But again, I should say it applies to other groups as well. For example, European Southern and European laborers coming over to work in a factory. But when we think about capitalism and its expansionist tendencies, right? You have to recognize the fact that the largest cost that cuts into your profit is labor. Okay. First of all, I should say this, that it's profit that's the motor of capitalism. So let me move to the next slide here. Okay, so as I mentioned in this slide at the very top there, this should seem intuitive to you that what propels capitalism, in its expansionist tendency is profit primarily. Okay, that is the motor, the engine of capitalist expansion, profit. Okay. For example, in our hypothetical case of a small coffee shop, the reason why they want to expand to the next area geographically is because of profit, right? You want to make more profit. And when you think about the nature of profit itself, okay, in principle, as a definition, profit could never be satisfied. Okay, the nature of profit is that you have to make more in the future than you did, at that present date. Needs to say more than you did in the past, right? It has to be larger. You have to make larger profit margins, right? So this means that this is the motor of capitalism again, okay? The pursuit of profit is what's leading to the geographic expansion of capitalism itself, okay? Now, I just mentioned this, that when we think about, costs, right, that are cutting into profit, and indeed, there's a saying here, a slogan that says, maximize profit, minimize costs. If you want to maximize your profit, well, you must minimize the costs involved in making your product, right? So most industrialists and capitalists realize that what's cutting most into their profit goals are the costs associated with labor. Okay, you have to pay wages to your laborers. Well, guess what? the amount of pay that you pay them, it cuts the most into your profits. Okay, and therefore, you could say that if this is the case, then you want to find the cheapest labor possible. Okay, so in other words, cheap labor is highly sought after by the capitalists, and especially at this stage. Okay, so the question emerges: where do you find the cheapest labor? Well, this takes us to the answer to that. It's usually found abroad, outside the borders of the United States. Okay, so hopefully you can see where I'm going here with this logic that I'm sort of spelling out in this interconnection, right? If profit is the engine of capitalist expansion, well, what cuts into profit the most is labor, excuse me, and therefore you want to find the cheapest labor possible. Where do you find this? Abroad. And this applies to the Italian immigrants coming over, the Jewish immigrants coming over, on the East Coast, Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island and all that. But in the West, where would the labor force be found? You don't really go to the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, to find the cheapest labor. You're in the American West, right? And therefore, you look to Asia. You look towards the Pacific Ocean. That is where you're going to find your cheapest labor. Okay, so again, hopefully you could see the interconnection here between, capitalist expansion driven by profit, the nature of labor, and how that's related to capitalist growth. And in our country, at least, how race figures prominently here. And, here you're seeing economics tied to race, right? To society, really. You're seeing how economics is interconnected to the racial dynamics, whether you're talking about the first African American slaves coming over, different ethnic groups from Europe, like the Irish, Polish, and so forth, Jewish, and even up till today when, for example, you have, Indian engineers or scientists coming over, where it's, not exactly unskilled labor, of course, it's highly skilled, but it's still cheaper to hire someone from India, let's say an engineer from India, compared to an engineer who just graduated from UCSD. It's cheaper. So many industries will do exactly that, right? Qualcomm will hire more foreign labor on an H-1B visa, right, compared to the native labor, right? Okay, so we'll move on to the next video.